In this presentation, I would like to take a look at the piston service for your Honda GC series engines. Before we jump into this lab, let's take a look at the expectations. So the expectations are outlined as follows. You are not actually going to perform these services on your engine, but you need to be familiar with them. The reason we're not performing these services on our engine is I cannot buy a ring set piecemeal, and if you break one ring, I'm looking at about $20+, which is a little bit less money than Honda used to charge for them, but that is per engine. So multiply that by about 75 engines, and you can see where things can go really bad. Additionally, if we put the piston in upside down, there can be valve clearance issues, and if we put the connecting rod in upside down, there will be clearance issues between the connecting rod's dipper on the rod cap and the side of the engine block. Basically, there's a lot that can go wrong in a very short amount of lab time, if you will. So what we're gonna do is we're gonna take you through the very beginning all the way to the very end of what you need to know if you are servicing this piston for yourself in a customer's Honda GC series engine. Let's go ahead and jump in and see what we have. So before we disassemble this piston, it's important to note the orientation of the components. Everything can install the wrong way, essentially, including the snap rings that actually hold the rod onto the piston. So it's very important to be mindful at how all of this stuff installs. So I'm going to start at the face here of the piston, if you will, and it's important to note that we have a couple of cutouts, some notches here for the valves. Okay, we're just going to highlight those so that they show up a little bit better. So you can automatically tell that this piston goes in a certain way. Most all pistons, this one included, have some sort of an identifier on them to signify which end faces the flywheel. So I'm going to go ahead and draw an arrow on this piston because that is the flywheel end. So this side here of the piston faces your flywheel because the valves are located not in the middle of the cylinder but offset just a little bit. The same thing is actually happening on the connecting rod. We talked earlier about Honda's little index mark that they left us. So the side with the slant is actually the flywheel. So I'm going to put an FW. I realize that's upside down from your perspective, but this is the flywheel end of the connecting rod. All right. When we take a look at the piston rings, it's important to note that there is a brand stamped on the piston ring. And most piston rings, I think in this case it's an A, it's a little bit hard to see on camera. The piston rings are directional. In other words, yes, you can install them upside down. Yes, it will work, but it will not work correctly. You'll also notice just by their color that there is an order. So the A brand faces the top of the piston, as you can see here on this ring. And then the second ring is the brown ring, and it has an A stamp on it as well if you rotate the ring gap such that you can see that branding on it. The oil control ring is the third ring down. It's a three-piece setup. That's what you find on the newer ones. It is not that specific as far as that's concerned. The only precaution we have to make with it is that we service the actual rings separately first from the spring that's located in the middle. So you can't get the spring in the middle out without removing the two individual ring sets. Lastly, taking a look here, hopefully you can kind of get some light on that. You're going to notice that there is a little pocket for the snap ring that holds the piston pin in. There is a gap in this little ring here as well. It's kind of hard to move at this point, but you never want the gap of the snap ring lined up with the gap right here. So Honda has installed the gap of the snap ring facing straight up here into this location. And that's exactly how we're going to reinstall that. If the gap were to be placed here, there's a possibility that the clip could work its way out. The piston pin will slide out and gouge its way into the cylinder and completely destroy the engine. All right, so let's go ahead and begin the disassembly here of this piston. So we've marked all the orientations again of where everything needs to go. We've discussed the branding, if you will, on the piston rings. So what we're going to do is you'll notice right here is a little bit of a gap. It's called a ring gap. What we're going to do is we're going to push it up, and then we're going to roll the ring across the face of the piston. You can't pull these things off like a snap ring. If you do, the rings will just break. They're usually made out of cast iron or some sort of equally brittle material. We're going to set that first compression ring off to the side, and then we're just so I can kind of keep the piston here in focus as best we can. We're going to do the exact same thing, but we're only going to do kind of one ringland here at a time. So we're going to spread that ring, and then we're going to work it up a little bit. Second one is usually a little bit more difficult than the first, just because we have to move it, a much wider distance, if you will. So just be careful not to flex and break the piston rings. Notice we're rolling them. The oil control, we're going to do the exact same thing with it, except it's 3-piece on the newer engines. I can literally just hook it with the skin of my finger, and we're going to bring it around, just kind of doing the roll. Very delicate, very careful, work it up. There are no branding marks whatsoever on this ring, so it can go on in either direction. It's the same. We're going to do the lowermost ring here. We just got to find the ring gap in it. Okay, and I find that sometimes it's actually easier to pull this one off the bottom of the piston, so that way it doesn't get stuck in 3 different ringlands as you kind of do your thing. So again, we're kind of literally rolling the ring with our fingers here. Okay, we don't want that little tail to get caught in the gap, and we're just going to roll it down the piston just like that, and we'll remove it. The spring in the middle usually just comes out. It doesn't interlock, it doesn't overlap, it's not extraordinarily brittle, but that is the 3-piece ring set for your new style piston. Make sure your ringlands are like super nice and clean. You might consider running a lint-free towel through them, getting some lubrication going all the way around. Make sure that your oil control ring holes are nice and clean and all of that good stuff. Before you put the new ring set in, there shouldn't be any binding. Everybody should float real nice, spin around nice and easy, and things like that. With the ring set out of the way, we're going to go ahead and remove this snap ring. I put my finger over the front, and I see it shoot out, and I see exactly where it went. So we'll just grab that here in a moment, and then we can push the piston pin here out of the piston. So just be very careful if you're doing that with a metal screwdriver. That is the wrist pin, or the piston pin, if you will. And at that point, the connecting rod and the piston can be separated. So if you're replacing the piston, now is the time to do that. If you're replacing the connecting rod, obviously you have to do those same performances, if you will, to make that happen. The only thing left in the piston is one additional little snap ring. I'm going to leave it in there because it's kind of pointless to take it out for this demonstration. Really, we just stand a risk of losing it. So let's go ahead and reinstall these components. I got everything wiped down. I'm just going to put a little bit of this Finish Line chain lube on it. Not a sponsor. Use the assembly lube of your choice, but I think this will work out pretty good. Pretty thick stuff. We're lubing up the wrist pin, so I like to use a light oil on that, something of that sort, as opposed to a grease or something that's going to pack in, because it doesn't get a ton necessarily of lubrication up here, so I don't want the oil to struggle to penetrate into that bushing. So what we're then going to do is I'm going to put a little bit of oil here in each end, if you will, of the piston for that initial lubrication, and I'm simply going to just spread that around as best I can using my finger on that. So make sure the pin slides in super nice and easy, and it does, which is good. We'll let that oil kind of work in there and do its thing. So next step is going to be to identify flywheel end, and that's what we're looking at here, and flywheel end on the connecting rod, and we're going to put them together. So I'm going to install the piston pin and then slide the rod in and then press the piston pin all the way down, give it just a little push screwdriver to make sure that it's set completely and that I have access to that little snap ring groove in there. So next up, we'll go ahead and install that snap ring. So the snap ring can be a little bit of a challenge, as you saw earlier. We're going to go ahead and simply grab it with a pair of pliers, and then I'm going to position the little opening of it so that it faces straight up. All right. Now it's going to be a challenge to get this guy installed and recorded here at the same time, just kind of by virtue of the amount of space that we have to work with. So hopefully it cooperates a little bit here and that you can see that on camera. But I'm thinking we can press part of that snap ring in. The exception of this top piece needs to move over. Kind of a delicate job. Okay, snap ring is now in and correctly clocked. And we have to make 100% sure that it is correctly seated in its groove the entire way around. That's a huge mistake, a simple oversight that can result in complete and total literal engine destruction. Not something we want. Let's double check our orientations. We have the bar here for flywheel end, and then we have our arrow here for flywheel end as well. So we have correctly installed the piston and the rod together as an assembly. Next up, we'll put the ring set on. That's a very delicate process here as well. So to make that happen, I'm simply going to put a drop of oil, or 5, in each ringland here. And that's going to serve to get oil behind the rings as we spin them around. Okay? So step 1, I'm going to take the spring and I'm going to install it in the lowest little spot there on the piston, the oil control side, if you will. I'm going to rotate that around a little bit to distribute some of that lubrication. We're going to take one of these oil control rings. We're going to install it again up from the bottom. We're going to carefully make sure that the ring gap, you can see that here, is not lining up with any of the little cutouts for that piston pin. If it does, it's going to tend to get caught in there and break, having been there and done that before, unfortunately. So all we got to do now is simply slide that ring up the side of the piston here. Just use your fingernails, guide it into place, a little bit on each side. A little piece of cotton dust or something in here. There we go. And it's in one piece. We're going to do the same exact thing with this ring, but I'm just going to do it from the top. It's your choice if you want to do all of them from the top or not. So hopefully you can see exactly how we're doing that. They do make a ring installation tool. I don't particularly care for it on this engine because the rings are so small. It's a lot easier on something like a car engine ring set where they're a little bit bigger. So that ring set is completely installed in the piston. Everybody is springy. We just want to make sure that the ring gap here isn't lining up with any of the holes and that it's not lining up with another ring gap. So we're good on that one. Next up is we're going to install the brown ring with the A branding, which is located literally right there, facing up. We're going to go ahead and roll that on just like such. I'm going to grab the end of that, stretch it over. Okay, everybody is cooperating. We got that in the first hole, or the first land so far here. We're simply going to guide it kind of around with our fingers. Part of the reason we put the oil on it. Okay, so far so good. Just double checking as we go. We're just going to grab that and move it to exactly where we want it, which is right there. We'll spin it around a bit. Everything's looking good. Next up, have the chrome ring, the A on it. We're going to do the exact same thing with that. There we go. That one was easy. Next up, we're going to clock the ring gaps at about 120 degrees. So I might put one here, and one here, somewhere about that, kind of a Y type of a shape. Make sure we're not lining up any of those ring gaps with any piston pin holes, which is a problem that Honda had when they manufactured this. I noticed that 2 ring gaps were actually lined up with each other, and we're lined up with a piston pin hole here pretty close. So we want to avoid this area here, and we want to avoid lining our ring gaps up here with each other, because that can cause some sealing issues as far as that's concerned. So once that's done, we're going to be finished with our piston service. This has been a look at how to correctly remove and replace the components involved in your Honda GC piston and rod assembly.